I start now.
Wait, what's starting? I missed this.
He's letting people into the session. Everyone you see here now is an interpreter or a participant.
Okay.
I love how mysterious you look, Molly. You're like a silhouette. Perfect for the anonymous interview.
I know this.
So thank you all for being here. I think we can start now with this webinar. This will be the first webinar of the day of Fridays for Future, where we will see what the consequences are of global warming when we hit the 1.5 degrees of global warming, but especially what we can do to prevent it. And therefore, for this webinar, we have our special guest, Disha Riva and the Yes Men. We are really happy to have you here, so thank you for that. Now some practical things. If you need translations, please go into the Zoom link and not into the YouTube Live, because we can only provide translations inside of the Zoom link. And we have translations in English, German, French, Portuguese, Spanish. Well, we're talking now in English, but just to know. And if you have questions during the webinar, you can always ask them inside the Q&A if you're in the Zoom link, and then we will answer them at the end, or at the YouTube Live, and then we will also answer them at the end. So for the extra people who joined in now, really nice that you are here. This will be the first webinar of the day in the series of Fight for 1.5, where we will see the consequences of global warming and what we can do to prevent it. So I think we can start now with our first guest that we have here, Disha Ravi. She is from Fridays for Future India and a frontline fighter against global warming. So, Disha Ravi, the floor is yours. Are you able to talk, Disha? Okay, so I'll guess we wait for another minute until Disha is here. So for the new people who joined in, really welcome that you're here. This is the first webinar of Fridays for Future today about Fight for 1.5, where we will see what the consequences are of global warming and especially what we can do to prevent it. And therefore we have a really awesome guest, Disha Ravi, who now has issues to connect, I guess, and the Yes Men who are here to explain what we can do to prevent it. I see Disha Ravi is connecting to her audio, so we will be able soon to hear from her what it means to her to do her climate activism and what the consequences are of global warming. So Disha, I see you're here back with us. So go ahead, the floor is yours. I see she has back issues with connecting. I'm waiting for the people of the webinar what we can best do now. So just to repeat the technical things, if you need translations, you can best go into the Zoom meeting, and there we have translations in German, English, Portuguese, and French, and you can ask questions in the Q&A section or in the YouTube Live. I'm seeing at the people of the webinar, maybe whether we can start with the Yes Men until Disha is able to connect back.
Great. Here we go. My name is Mike. I'm one of two of the original founding members of the Yes Men, but we're an ever expanding and contracting group of people. And we have another Yes Man on the call right now, who's called Molly, who's in silhouette and in my frame right next to me. Actually, I could probably reach through the wall into that wooden box she's sitting in, and yeah, we're right here together. So, Molly may chime in from time to time, but to keep it simple, I'll be talking to you directly. Now, this issue about the impacts of climate change, and of course, the push for 1.5 is absolutely critical, and it's something that we've been obsessed with for decades, couple decades. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about today, and I was really interested in hearing from Disha about the impacts on the front lines and more impacted countries, places like India, um, and how we can try in our privileged positions of being in less impacted countries or countries with more money, um, create conditions that allow for change. And sometimes it's about helping figure out how change can happen elsewhere when we hit dead ends in our own countries. On a federal level in places like the US, dealing with national policy, it's really been impossible for the last 4 years because we've had kind of a tyrant president who is not going to be influenced by our pressure. And so we have to start looking at other tactics and how we can act locally, and also how we can influence things like corporations that are susceptible to public pressure and to people pressure and to um, threats to their brands, things like that. So we have to look at all the tactics at our disposal. And today I'm going to talk about how to do that and have fun while doing it at the same time. So I'm going to share my screen here. Oops, I forgot to do the to actually open the presentation. Oh, here we go. So I figure this is maybe not an actual photo. This is an actual photo of you right now being fired out of a cannon. This is basically where we're at right now. I think all of us. That this, you can go wherever you want with this metaphor, but this is where we are at globally in reference to climate change, and we got to figure out how we're going to make this landing smoothly. One of the ways that we've figured out or understood that a place where we all share common ground is in the sort of trickster archetypes historically. So this is you reading about historic activism. This is another photograph of you actually at home reading. And we, the Yes Men, have been creative activists. What we do is create actions that get media attention for campaigns that need some attention in order to create change. It's not the most important part of activism because organizing, um, um, sorry, I'm trying to find my other window here. Oops, lost it. Okay, well, I'll just stay with my screen share. Because doing the hard work of activism often requires organizing big groups of people, and keeping things going. Sometimes the hard work of fundraising and involving and growing the numbers of people involved in your campaigns. But large social movements have always been accompanied by symbolic actions that tell the stories of movements. And it's those stories that that keep people engaged and that keep people remembering and moving those ideas forward. So we have found that we can find inspiration and common ground with everybody all over the world in trickster stories. And I'll explain more about this in a moment, but we've started a thing called the Trickster Academy. And it's based on the idea that we are always underdogs. We all have myths. All of our cultures have myths or sometimes stories based in reality that have been told for generations about less powerful entities overcoming a more powerful entity, often an oppressor, by using their agility and wits instead of using strength. And these stories are the stories that we are interested in retelling and looking for ways of telling them in order to serve activist movements. And I'll show you what I mean in a moment. This is one of our early logos for the Trickster Academy, a proto logo that says, together outfox. And that's the idea. We are going to outfox people. And why the fox? Because the fox is one of these typical trickster characters. It's a European trickster character from European myths, but my mother is Dutch, and so I figured that this would be a good one to talk about. Reynard the fox. The fox as a character that outfoxes and outwits other animals in order to, and sometimes there's lessons to be told there. That's what we're interested in. Now, because I was just talking about some European traditions, I'm going to start with this guy. This is an actual photograph of Jesus 2,000 years ago, riding a donkey. Now, I know, it's probably easier to ride a donkey than walk. I don't think so. Jesus could have ridden he could have ridden a horse. He could have ridden a mule. He could have ridden something bigger than a donkey. But the whole point of riding the donkey was to create a story. It was to create a spectacle. The idea was that it would be a way of showing that he wasn't ostentatious, that he wasn't powerful, that he wasn't the king that people might have been calling him. So this spectacle of riding a donkey into town wasn't practical. It wasn't efficient. It was a symbolic action meant to tell a story that then people would retell and would become part of the idea that eventually became now this massive giant religion that's all over the world and is a huge problem for many people. But at the time, this is what I'm trying to show you here is that this is a tactic, right? This kind of symbolic action is a tactic that of course predates Jesus. Jesus was just adapting things from the myths and histories that came before. This is Nasruddin riding a donkey backwards. And I just thought I'd show it as a sort of answer to Jesus's riding a donkey forwards. There's a story here as well. I'm going to let you look it up later. Here's an example of a pamphlet called A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People from Being a Burden to their Parents or the Country, and for making them beneficial to the public. In this proposal from the late 1700s, Jonathan Swift wrote, this is a bit of satire, and he wrote that the Irish should eat their own children. And of course, this was a joke, but people didn't realize it until getting, a little ways into the document. And it was meant to ridicule or reveal what was wrong with the British policy of starving the Irish, because at the time, Ireland actually had food. It's just that they were exporting it. So like the situations we often have today when there is starvation, it's usually not a lack of food that's the problem, it's a lack of money. I mean, there is the lack of food that's involved, but very often if people in the place that were starving had money, there would be ways of getting them food. So, but this has been going on for centuries, and it is a function of capitalism. Okay, to fast forward to the women's suffrage movement, this is a photograph from 1921. These women are dressing up. They're dressing up. First of all, they're choosing uniforms so that they look good in photographs, so that they create a image that people can tell a story about. And in this case, they're doing this kind of very fashionable 1921 vision of sort of recreation of this idea of Greek democracy in their tunics Um, so, but again, it's about costume. They became quite famous for wearing white and wearing these sort of Edwardian white dresses that you would see in a lot of the early photos of the women's suffrage movement. But again, they were thinking about the photograph, thinking about how people told the story, how people retold the story. One thing I want to remember when we look at these is that they thought about everything as a kind of spectacle, as a kind of stage play. That doesn't mean that they were wearing these dresses because it went also in contrast with the direct action and civil disobedience that they were doing. There were thousands of arrests made. Many times they were, actually fighting physically with the police. This was not it was a nonviolent movement, but there was lots of violence that was done to them, these women who were simply trying to get the right to vote. And when violence was done to them, that's when it told the story of how unjust everything was. And so wearing that white dress made it even more of an outrageous spectacle that people could really get angry about. Sometimes all you have to do is reinvent the wheel. If something has happened before and it worked, referring to it now or using that tactic again can also work. In this case, here's a group called Climate Rush. Around 2008, 2009 in the UK, they were getting a lot of attention by dressing like suffragettes. This was a mostly women's group that was protesting, and they managed to get climate issues into the pages of the tabloid newspapers that normally didn't cover it because they were photogenic. They got the job done. Again, wearing white. This is referencing the suffragettes. Here we see AOC, one of our Congress people here in the United States, a very progressive congresswoman who is being sworn in and was careful when she was sworn into office to wear the white, referencing those early suffragette movements. So these ideas, these symbols don't go away, and they continue to be used and reused to tell the stories. Here is Gandhi spinning his own cotton thread to be used, to be woven into his own clothes. And this was a symbolic action, making your own clothes, part of the Indian self-reliance or Swadeshi movement that was all about becoming self-reliant from the British colonial government. But let's face it, I mean, did Gandhi really have time to make his own clothes if he was also trying to coordinate a movement, the largest progressive movement in the history of the world, the Indian independence movement? He didn't have, nobody has time for that if they're managing it, but you do it, or he did it, because it was something that could be done symbolically that would mean something. And of course, he had following him a lot of prominent journalists, including these sort of embedded reporters like from the International Herald Tribune. And so this is also a spectacle. This is a way of demonstrating that India can be independent, and that India should in fact do its own thing without the British government, that they don't need to be taxed for cotton and clothes. The Salt March, another example of that idea of self-determination. In India at the time, the British colonial government, this is pre-independence, the British colonial government taxed salt, which was something that critical that everybody needed. And so this is the equivalent of doing something like taxing water. It's a way of keeping control of the population. And so in order to demonstrate independence from the British colonial government, the independence movement held a march to the sea, where several marches actually to the sea, where they simply evaporated salt from the seawater and made salt. So they defied the tax and they defied the ban on making salt at home. And in doing so, asserted independence, but also gathered a lot of attention. And this is a picture of the one of the salt marches. And here is an example of another. This is just a print of another salt march that went to the Darsana Salt Depot. So when marching to the coast, didn't get as much of a violent reaction from the state as I think the leaders of this movement thought would be useful for broadcasting their message both within India and throughout the world. They decided to march to the salt factory to make demands there. And when they did that, of course, the British met them with extreme violence. And all of these nonviolent people who were not holding weapons all got, beaten up by the armed police. And it, of course, created waves throughout the world because at the time, Britain was projecting this idea that they were a paternalistic, benevolent leader of their colonies. And so this really revealed the falsehoods of that British narrative. And again, this is the trickster. We're looking at this through the lens. We like to think of it as looking through the lens of the trickster, using wits in order to outsmart the opposition. And in many times, what you're doing is you're revealing something about their nature. Here's another tactic: occupation. This is a group called the Bonus Marchers, who are marching and setting up their tents on Washington, D.C. in great numbers. These occupations are very effective. And in many ways, Fridays for Future comes out of a kind of an occupation, the school strike, that idea of standing alone and not going to school. Just, and striking outside the school is a kind of solitary single occupation that then became many, many more. Here's another example of this, the types of occupations. This is from Spain, and it's, of course, over 60 years later, during the Indignados movement, which just preceded the Occupy Wall Street action, which was another occupation. Here's another thing, bus protest. This was during the United States. In the US, there was the civil rights movement, where African Americans were advocating for their full rights to vote, and not to be intimidated, and also to have equal rights to public spaces. And so there were a whole bunch of people who were doing things like refusing to give up the seats on the front of the bus when they were told they had to sit on in the back, which was the law in many of the southern states at the time. So this is an example of one woman who is doing that. This is not the more famous Rosa Parks, who years later became quite famous for her case. But here's a picture of Rosa Parks sitting on the bus. Now, I want to point out that this picture is probably the most famous picture of Rosa Parks sitting on the bus. And for years, I saw this in school. She's refusing to give up her seat to a white person. But I saw this in school and I assumed this was a real photo of what had happened. This was Rosa Parks, documentary evidence. But this is actually a staged photo that was created. There were no photos of the event where Rosa Parks actually, the first time she said she refused to give up her seat and was arrested. She did it many times. She was a trained activist working with an activist organization. And in this photo, what you see is a journalist who actually volunteered to sit down behind her so there could be a better photo, so that the photo would work better for telling the story. So this is not fake. This is a real photo. This is not fake news. This is a real photo of her really riding in the front seat of the bus. It's just that it has staged elements. And this is another lesson that you can learn. You can control your story. And one of the challenges that we try to address is how to tell the best story. How do you tell the story that gets your perspective told, especially in this very busy day and age when news media is so filled with all kinds of reporting? Over the centuries, though, many different tactics have evolved. And so the good news is you just have to look at what's happened before. I mean, one thing is to create a simple message and to repeat it like they did at this also civil rights protest in Memphis in the United States in the 60s. And while they were there at that protest, the government sent out the National Guard. So that meant that they had all these troops there with their bayonets drawn. And so rather than rather than gather in a clump like this, they realized, wow, we could make this a great photo op that shows the violence of the state as opposed to what we're doing. And so by walking single file, they created this iconic photo of the moment, walking between the tanks and the soldiers. And this is largely improvised. So this is also working on the site, figuring out, okay, how can we make this better? And of course, there is one anomaly in this photo. We have this white guy with a tie without the sign on. But you know, other than that, the photo is maybe perfect. But you know, if we analyze this, we could also say, oh, maybe this white guy with the tie is meant to be represent something that the idea of this was also to appeal to middle of the road Americans, to get to places where people would be outraged by the idea that they would be meeting these men who are just carrying an I am a man sign with this kind of force. This doesn't show that that violence is needed. And so maybe this guy here represents kind of the middle American white person who they were trying to persuade to support the civil rights movement. Important to remember here is that with movements, you don't need to have everybody to make change. You need a small group of dedicated people, and then the vague support of a lot of people. And that's where you guys are at. You're the dedicated group, small group of people. And the tipping point on climate change, we keep thinking it's around the corner, but I think that you will see it. It's just we don't know when that watershed moment will be. Sometimes you just have to tell a really funny story. Here's a picture of Abby Hoffman, one of the leaders of the Yippie movement in the 60s. They had a big protest planned for Washington, D.C. And to get people excited about it, they announced that they were going to levitate the Pentagon, which is the largest, they call it the largest building in the world. That's what they say about the Pentagon. They were going to surround it, hold hands, 500,000 people holding hands in a giant circle around a giant Pentagon-shaped building. And then using magic, they were going to levitate it into the air. And they applied for permits to levitate the building. So they wrote up these permit applications and sent them in, and at the same time sent them to journalists and announced they were going to do it. And so, of course, everybody loved this story. It just added another layer to the story, and it added a layer of mischief that got people more involved and made more people show up. Here's another occupation. Indians of all tribes occupying Alcatraz. And, again, they showed up wearing for a lot of events, they were wearing their ceremonial clothes. They were doing ceremony, but it wasn't like, if you wanted to make the point that Indians were occupying Alcatraz, which is what they were doing as Indians of all tribes, they wore their ceremonial clothes for a lot of their press engagements and photo ops, so that the story traveled further. And of course, at Standing Rock, where ceremony was also very important, it created better images that traveled further. So as you can see, these tactics, which are also part of the traditions of cultures, are being recycled and used again and again because they work. Okay, by the way, Standing Rock, which was an occupation of a piece of land that a huge pipeline was going through in the United States, trying to block the pipeline, a blockade and an occupation at the same time. This is a woman called Rashida B here in the foreground, who is with a movement in Bhopal that's been fighting for the rights of the victims of the world's largest industrial accident. In 1984, the Union Carbide company had a plant there that was inadequately built and maintained, and that sprung a leak of toxic gas that killed 8,000 people and made a lot of people sick for life. And so this group is constantly reinventing themselves and creating tactics for getting their message into the international media repeatedly, because they want to keep pressure on Dow Chemical to do the right thing. They actually are pretty aware that they will never receive, Dow Chemical that bought Union Carbide is never going to say that they did the wrong thing, but they recognize that their goal is to put pressure on these companies and put pressure on governments to regulate them, to prevent them from doing the wrong thing in the future. This photo shows people with brooms. That's because they're constantly having to clean up the messes of politicians. So the broom is an icon. It's easy. Everybody has one at home. And they can, chase people and beat them with the brooms without actually hurting them, which they do. So this is showing that sometimes you just need to find something. You don't have to have a lot of resources at your disposal. Sometimes you just need to find something that you all already have and then use it together in numbers in creative ways. A few other images I'm going to skip through quickly that are just ways that you can again represent something. This is an anti-war protest in the early 90s in the United States. It shows the boots of, the idea is boots of soldiers, boots on the ground. Billboard alteration, another simple thing that you can do. This one is just spray painted. It says, if it were a lady, it would get its bottom pinched. This is an advertisement from the 1960s for a car, and it's sexist. And so somebody wrote, if this lady was a car, she would run you down. Sometimes you can change the name of an entire street. This is something that's happened over and over in different places. This is a clip, a little still frame from a news piece about a thing that I had done in the 90s, changing a name of a street to Malcolm X Street. There's a whole long story behind it, but I'm in the interest of speed, I'm going to keep moving forward. Holly weed. The advocates for marijuana in the United States have been pretty successful over the last 30 years in legalizing marijuana. This is, of course, one of these guerrilla actions that happened at some point where they changed the Hollywood sign to say Hollyweed. And, I show this as a kind of joke because it's just about making a marijuana legal, which doesn't seem like the loftiest of campaign goals. It's certainly not as high up on my list as preventing climate change. However, it's a big deal for some people, and it motivated a lot of people, and they've basically won. The U.S. is going to make marijuana legal all federally pretty soon, probably. It's looking likely. So the point is that these symbolic actions contribute to campaigns that win. Sometimes they're really cheap. Here is a quarter page of the cover of the New York Times, this is advertising space you can't buy. And it says free Tibet on the banner. a bunch of activists only had to be able to climb on the Golden Gate Bridge in order to do this. So it took some daring do, but it didn't take money. And this is a campaign from Greenpeace where they had Barbie, they had Ken break up with Barbie. So Ken and Barbie, the dolls, because Barbie's packaging was made from paper sourced in the Indonesian rainforest. So old growth forest was being cut down to create packaging for a children's toy. And so Greenpeace wanted to bring attention to this. They came up with this crazy idea that they would have Ken break up with Barbie because he was angry that she wasn't more environmentally oriented. And I thought it was crazy. They talked to me about it, and I thought this is way too complicated a story to tell, but I was wrong. It worked really well. And people all over the world were talking about how Mattel should stop using paper from trees from the rainforest. Sometimes if you don't have the money to make a big banner or even the daring do, you can find other places to write your messages. This is a very simple message on a beach in San Sebastian in Spain, where there was an old tradition of advertising on the beach because there's a boardwalk up above the beach that you can walk on. This says "Estamos vigilando," which is just, we are watching, and it was referencing a new set of surveillance cameras that had been put in. This is in the early 90s. So it was a protest against the surveillance that was going on. Sometimes a costume goes a long way. Here's Super Barrio. This is a superhero that emerged in 1987 after the earthquake in Mexico City, when the government was immediately trying to help the rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods were being left in rubble. And so Super Barrio started showing up and offering his support. This is like a superhero based on the Mexican wrestling characters that Mexico popular culture loves so much already. But obviously it was also with humor. You see like Super Barrio here, you can see that he's not physically maybe what you'd expect from a wrestler who's going to win all his matches. But he had passion and compassion, and he would show up in these poor neighborhoods and the media would follow him. And he got to be so popular. He was so personable. He'd have groups of children running after him. The media would be following him, and he would demand to wrestle the negligent politicians. And they would build wrestling rings, and he would demand that they show up. And eventually he got so popular that it became embarrassing for these public figures not to meet with him. And so he would have sit-down meetings, mock wrestling matches, and it was just a way for providing a voice for these communities that were being neglected. And yeah, very successful. Here's Super Barrio 5 years later. He's lost a little bit of weight there. And he's meeting with the Zapatistas, which are, of course, an armed rebellion in Chiapas in Mexico, that also wore masks. They wore masks for different reasons, but they used the these sort of charismatic archetypes in similar ways. The Zapatistas, as an armed uprising, really did want anonymity. That's not to say that the leader of the Zapatistas, Subcomandante Marcos, he's not the leader, he's the sub-leader. He's the subcomandante. The commander, the commander is actually Commander Ramona. And here she is. And she's, you can see, is a small indigenous woman, older woman, an elder, who is the leader of the movement. And so, but again, the masks, these people, it's not like the government couldn't figure out who they were, but everybody could be a Zapatista by putting on that Zapatista mask. And of course, this protected not the leaders of the Zapatista movement, but everybody who would also become one and associate with themselves with it. And it fits within these traditions of masking the masked hero, right? And it worked very well for an international audience, and this really is the thing that started this sort of anti-globalization movement, which in a lot of ways is a predecessor to the movement that we all are a part of with the climate movement, because it was fighting against the neoliberalism that was pushing capitalism into a state of no return, into a state where it became impossible, or it becomes impossible to stop, even when our future depends on it. And because the militant image wasn't serving them for that long, about 5 years later, they started to do things like use pink colors and play football. So this is an image, a Banksy image of the Zapatista football games and the marches that they did. They did these encuentros where they marched to Mexico City and play volleyball and games along the way. So they started to change their tactics when the image of the masked image and the idea of an armed struggle was no longer as popular. Sometimes you can paint a tank pink. That makes it very simple if you have one. You don't need to have a tank though. You can also just make a tank cozy. So you can knit things to put over tanks if you're an anti-war activist like these people in the UK are. You can, however, if you can get your own tank, you might want to do it. This is a group called the Space Hijackers, who are on their own kind of mock tank that they brought to an arms fair in London. This turned out to actually just be the decoy tank because they had another one. Tanks are cheap in the UK. So activists sometimes buy them to do to do their protests. And in this case, they were able to drive this tank straight into the arms fair itself because everybody thought a tank should belong there, even though they didn't know that it was full of activists who were actually crashing the party and were opposed to the arms fair. This is a rather gruesome image of the red shirts in Thailand. I only show it because sometimes it's not funny. Sometimes it's really about the poetics, and it's about a symbolic action that makes people cringe in this case. So they drew their own blood and they dumped it at the gates of the parliament, which is, and it was a very gruesome image, but everybody around the world, not everybody, but a lot of people saw this. It made the New York Times. Prior to this, I had no idea what the red shirts movement was. I mean, it was just these images that got all over the world. This is the Tutti Bianchi in Italy during the anti-globalization movement, dressing up with protective clothing that's themed but also funny because they're expecting to be beaten by the carabinieri, the police. So this is anti-globalization movement. But again, thinking it through, creating a kind of uniform image that's going to travel better and going to represent that you are not the violent one, that the violence is being done to you. This is one of the principles of nonviolence, is illustrating that the violence is happening on behalf of those in power. It's not it's being perpetrated by those in power, because the story often gets told the opposite way. If you have a protest and something goes down, even if property gets damaged, that kind of thing, or if there's clashes with police. That's why sometimes you have to build a teddy bear catapult. This is from a protest. These are actual real policemen seizing the catapult that was used in a protest in Quebec City against the free trade area of the Americas. A group of activists built this to hurl teddy bears, a medieval siege device to hurl teddy bears over the walls and into where the world leaders are meeting. And of course, when the funny part of this is not hurling the teddy bears, is when the police arrive and seize the catapult. They have to arrest the catapult. They have no choice. This is what's called a dilemma action. And most of the things that we try to do have an element of this dilemma. If the person you are attacking, or that you are, let's say not attacking, but the person you're trying to reveal as a hypocrite, the person or the entity, you want to get them in a position where any move they make is a bad one. It's like a kind of symbolic checkmate, right? Because in this case, they could have let the activists continue to hurl the teddy bears into the compound, and there wouldn't have been this image of the police arresting the catapult, and it may not have made the news. But they couldn't do that, because then the story would be that the activists kept hurling the teddy bears and they didn't do anything. So instead, they seize the catapult and then they look ridiculous. So whatever action the police take, they look silly. Sometimes you don't need to build a catapult. You can just strap some bread to your head, as Egyptian activists did during the Arab Spring in 2011, 2012. Basically, the idea was that they were going to be beaten by police, and they wanted to emphasize the idea, a counter narrative to the state's story that the activists were violent, was to demonstrate that they were the victim of violence. And in this case, people started to strap weird things to their heads in lieu of a helmet. And it was very funny. And I think often we don't remember as well the funny stories that keep the activists excited about participating in the movement. But this is one of those images of the fun that people have along the way. You don't have to be serious about everything. And sometimes you don't have to have anything. You don't even need bread. All you need is your naked body. Naked protests are not always appropriate in every country, in every place and time, but they tend to be very effective in the United States, because people always are shocked by nudity. Go figure. Don't get it. I don't quite get it, but it's still the case. And here, again, sometimes, doing something not sexy, but that refers to sex, gets attention. Here's a giant condom that's actually been placed over the house of a conservative politician in the United States. And this is a politician who was blocking funding for AIDS. And so an organization called ACT UP, working with Greenpeace, actually did this. They built a giant inflatable condom and they stuck it over the guy's house. So it created a lot of news and attention. And one more dick joke, because, because they're effective again, sometimes. This is a flying dildo copter that was launched against Kasparov, the former chess champion and political candidate who was running against Putin. Now, I also show this slide because this is an example of a creative action that was probably done. It could have even been done by the KGB, because, they were flying it against Kasparov, the opposition. Basically, all it was a flying penis that flew in and went near where he was speaking until somebody batted it out of the air. But it became a massively viral video in the very earliest days of viral video, embarrassing the candidate, and also actually, introducing the idea that he was a candidate to many people in the world who had no clue that there was what was happening in Russia. But my point there is that was not necessarily, these tactics are used by everybody. It's not just the underdogs. And so when people in power are using them, we consider that that's a serious danger. Here's another dick joke. If you watch any of the Yes Men movies, we often use very kind of base humor because it's the symbolic things that often represent power, like the phallus, the giant phallus. And in this case, this is Andy, who is the co-founder of the Yes Men, wearing an inflatable golden phallus, that the story, we gave this presentation at a textiles conference impersonating the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And the audience believed that he was really a WTO rep. And you can watch this. I'm going to share some links in the chat of Yes Men films so that you can see this action take place. So I had one action that I wanted to talk about in specific related to today, and I'm going to quickly go over this. So this is a group here called the Climate Debt Agents. It's a group of young people who we met in Denmark. They were working with ActionAid. You can see it on their sign. And it was a group of young Danish people and young activists, mostly from Africa, from a few other places in the world as well, who had gathered at the Copenhagen Climate Conference. And their demands were that the so-called developed world start seeing and meeting the needs of the most impacted places in the world, the places that were seeing the effects of climate change in the most dramatic way. And so they brainstormed how they would do it. And they decided that they would be working on the issue of climate debt, the idea that rich countries owe money to poor places in order to address the impacts of climate change, in addition to the preventive measures they should be implementing. And so they thought, well, we're going to be collecting that climate debt. That's what we're doing. And so they came up with this idea of what a debt collector might look like and this sort of outrageous costume. And they went around demanding a collection of the debt. They asked us if we would help figure out other creative ways that they could get their message out there. And so everybody was trying to get into the Copenhagen Climate Conference in order to do their actions. But in order to get in, you needed to conform to certain rules and regulations, and there's only so much that you could do inside. So we came up with an idea for how we could get in without getting in. These are microphones. They're not actually microphones. They're just pieces of tape and sponges and straws. But these are the microphones. These are based on the microphones that they actually had inside the conference room. We decided that if we built a fake version of the place, the main podium where people speak at the Copenhagen Climate Conference, we could create videos that looked like they were coming actually from inside the conference. So we launched in this program with a bunch of art students and the climate debt agents. We basically took all of their logos and we printed them out, and we built a funny little studio. And one of the climate debt agents, whose name is Kodili Chandia, and here she is on the right here, she's from Uganda, decided that she would be the representative of Uganda, and we would make an announcement on behalf of Canada and Uganda, where Canada was in fact changing their policy. So we're making a positive announcement. Canada is changing their policy and going to settle their climate debt, pay their climate debt to Uganda. This is, let's see if we can see a little video of what the videos looked like. This is a slightly unprocessed video. I went through another iteration, but I'm going to show you one of the videos that we made in that set, in that basement.
I'm very pleased to announce that Canada pledges reductions targets of 40% below 1990 levels by 2020 and 80% by 2050. These targets are feasible, and the only responsible action to all nations of the world is to enact comparable baselines.
So, so they had these videos on their website, the COP15 official website, the UN website, had all of these little short clips of news highlights. And So we made that video. We put a little bit more reverb on the audio so it sounded like it was in a big room. And we posted it on the fake website for the COP15, sent it out with a press release announcing all of the great things Canada was doing, that they created this about face. And it got a huge amount of attention because people mistook it for the real conference website and the real video. Oops. So yeah, here's the fake representative of Canada, along with the fake representative of Uganda, making the announcement together in the press briefing room. We had two different rooms, the press briefing room and the big giant audience, both of which were, in our case, in the same basement where we were just making sure that the shot looked okay. So I'm gonna show you the announcement that Kudili made. Oops.
Dearest delegates and fellow citizens around the globe, this is the day that will define our century. Canada is fully acknowledging its historical climate debt and the legal responsibility that follow. Today, we no longer have to wait for a COP20 or COP100 before the voices of our children could be heard. Now that we are friends, I can say, it is high time Canada changed. Until now, you have blocked the climate negotiations and refused to reduce your share of emissions. Of course, you sit on the world's second largest oil reserve, but to us, it is not a mere economic issue. You were holding a loaded gun to our heads and seemed ready to pull the trigger on millions of us around the globe. You left us no choice but to see you as criminal. We know what courage it has taken you to accept this responsibility. You have turned over a new leaf. Today, we jumpstart the reconciliation process by codifying the polluter pays principle into climate laws. Canada is leading us towards a more just and equitable sharing of global resources. This agreement reminds us, and everyone gathered here in Copenhagen, that climate debt reparations are not aid. They are a legal framework that sets everyone on equal footing. Let me conclude on a humble personal note. When growing up in Uganda, school books taught me of history as something written by big, white and serious-looking men in dark suits. This day has taught me another lesson. History is what we, the people of the world, push forward on its next march. I am deeply grateful for having had the chance to be the humble conveyor of history's march today. Thank you.
Oops. Okay. So, eventually the group takes responsibility for the action. So it created a wave of press at first when people thought that it was real news coming out of the actual Copenhagen Climate Conference. It got a ton of media particularly in Canada, where a lot of Canadians even didn't realize that their country was such a such a bad player on the global stage when it came to climate change. And what it did is create this sort of bridge between the sort of most impacted countries and the countries that were causing the most impact. And I think that I'm really proud of that action for doing that, but I think that obviously we have such a long way to go in terms of making those things happen, making these connections happen more in the future. I just got an email from, I just got an email from a friend who works with the Yes Men a lot, who does a lot of work in the Philippines, and was talking about how dire the situation is there. Some of the leading climate activists in the Philippines are in hiding. Many land activists and climate activists have been murdered. It's a terrible situation over there. And he was saying, like, how can we do something about this now? How do we put pressure on putting pressure on the Philippine government is really hard because they also have a Trump-like tyrant, even worse, because he has more powers over there with Duterte. And so how do we do it? What kinds of things can we do? And I think that this is a really big challenge for us, is to make these connections with people who in these most impacted countries and figure out how we can make a difference that actually has an impact in those places as well as here. It's almost embarrassing how little progress we've made in the last decade. I mean, it is embarrassing. It's a joke, especially if coming from the United States, it's gone backwards. And so the question is, what do we do now? We're in a really interesting position in the US because we now have a more progressive president coming in. And so we might be able to affect change in terms of legislation, and that's exciting. But we also need to figure out ways of acting outside of the government issues. So for example, with the Philippines, I might look at places where we might have influence, like the tech industry is so heavily involved in that, since the tech industry is, the tech industry is very, very present. They get a lot of their human labor from the Philippines. And so
Okay.
look at how we could work there. Oh, I think we're out of time.
Yeah, we're getting out of time, Mike, but it was really interesting to hear of you. And I think we now have all more of an idea of how we can create these kinds of actions. But before we go over to Disha Ravi, we first have a question for you. Because you say in the beginning of your presentation, you said that certain forms of activism continue to work. But when I look to my own environment, I also see that the counter movement of those kinds of action is also growing. So do you have a way to make sure that that the general public doesn't get tired of these kinds of actions, because the climate movement is growing, but so is the counter movement? So it would be great if you can respond this quickly.
Yeah. So, I mean, my sense of it is that you need to continually evolve and change your tactics. But at the core of all this is really telling your story, and that we never get tired of. It's this like central core human impulse. And so what we need to do is figure out the best ways of telling these stories. And it keeps changing. And, it's like I said earlier, it's not always about it being funny. It's about what moves people, and what motivates people, what moves people, what gets more people involved. So yeah, I think that it's all about diversifying tactics and also learning and listening very carefully to especially to what people have to say who are from the most impacted places, and trying to figure out how to work with what they're saying, and make if that is something that's invisible where you're from, how to make that thing that's invisible visible is a big question.
Okay, thank you, Mike, and thank you for the Yes Men in general. I think we're all exciting to hear what you will do in the future. So now you've explained really well of what activism can be, but now we have our next guest, Disha Ravi, and if everything's okay, she now has a stable connection, and she will explain us more why it is so important that we fight against climate change, because if I'm correct, she already feels the consequences. So Disha Ravi, we're eager to hear your story.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to the Yes Man. That was such a great presentation. It was like so nice to listen to at least some chunks of it, because I got cut off for the larger part. But so hello everyone. My name is Disha A. Ravi. I'm from Fridays for Future India. So I think today everyone knows that we're gathered here to fight for 1.5. But what exactly does fighting for 1.5 mean? So let's rewind a little bit, and currently we are at 1.5 at 1.2. And what exactly, I just want to start off with what exactly 1.2 looks like for me. And this is how my world looks. My city our city's underground water levels are expected to be depleted in the next 2 years. More than 50% of my country, that is India, already has no access to safe drinking water. We are currently in a pandemic, and everyone's asking us to wash our hands and stay safe, wash your hands for 20 seconds. But how exactly are people going to wash their hands when they have no access to water? How exactly are we supposed to stay safe when one of our most basic necessities aren't met? I grew up in a farm. My grandparents are farmers, and I grew up watching my grandparents struggle with the water crisis we have in India. We always either had no water from the ground or we had too much water from the rain. So we went months without water, which led to failure of our crops and us having no food to eat, no money to buy food. And this was a recurring issue that I grew up with. And yet I didn't realize that this was the climate crisis, because growing up, we had no access to climate education. My school didn't teach me about it. And it was only later when I was in university and when I finally had the time to do my own research, did I find out about why this happened. And that's when I made the linkage. And this just goes to show how much of an importance climate education makes. And the water is a very, very powerful source, but we have also suffered from a lot of it, or too much of it, or too little of it. And this year, my country experienced more than 4 floods. My own house was flooded, partially because of the climate crisis, and partially because we can only afford to live in an area with poorly managed drainage systems. And we probably will be hit by the climate crisis sooner than the others. A lot of people don't think, at least in India, they don't think that living in low-income housing or in areas, that are more prone to the climate crisis is an actual issue. But farmers have been living in areas that are more prone to the climate crisis than the others. Fishermen in Mumbai, fishermen in Goa have already been experiencing the climate crisis. When the floods hit, they're always the most impacted by the climate crisis. And they already experienced one this year. Out of the most populated cities in the world, 21 out of the 30 cities were in India. And that was just last year. And my city was one amongst them. The AQI in India is way over the recommended levels. 1.6 million, that's like 1.6 million people are a lot of people that die of air pollution. And they died last year because of air pollution. And this just scrapes the surface of what 1.2 is going to look like. I don't even want to get started on what 1.5 is, but we are fighting for it. So by 1.5, my house is probably not going to have access to water, among millions of other people. Millions of other people won't have the most basic necessities of their lives met. I think one of the first things we learn when we move up in high school in economics and psychology is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and in the most basic and psychological and physical need is water. And we're not going to have that. We don't already have that. And by 1.5, I can't even imagine how much water we're not going to have, because we're already suffering from the water crisis in India. The current air we breathe is already toxic for us. And it's going to be much more toxic in I don't even know when we're going to reach 1.5, because the way we're going, it might be sooner than expected. The air we breathe will not only be toxic for us, it won't be breathable air. Flooding will be everyday occurrences instead of once in 4 times in a year because of rising sea levels. We won't just be living, we will be struggling to survive every single day. And after all of this, world leaders think that 1.5 is ambitious. 1.5 is nowhere close to being enough. It's not even the bare minimum. And they have the audacity to call it ambitious. Maybe if it was the lives of the white men and rich men online, we wouldn't be having these problems because we'd be discussing solutions. This is why we need to fight for 1.5, because we also need reparations. We need equitable justice that is led by the most affected people and areas. And I promise you that the people will fight for it, regardless of what the world leaders do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for this testimony, Disha, or however, because I think I pronounced it not correctly.
No,
Sorry
you
for that.
actually got it right. You actually got it right.
Okay. So if people have questions for her, feel free to put it in on Zoom or at YouTube. But I was wondering because you are explaining of like that like if it would affect white rich men, that it would be totally different approach. But do you have except of the things that the yes men already explained so good, things that we can do as Fridays for Future to help you with that fight?
I think one of the most important things that we did this year was we launched Fridays for Future MAPA. MAPA is most affected people and areas, and everyone has been amplifying the voices of MAPA. And it's so important that we continue to amplify that, because 1.5 is only going to save the lives of people in the global north. It's not going to be enough for us in the global south. I think that's an important conversation we need to have, and it's one that we aren't having at the moment. And we need a just and equitable transition. We need a recovery from this. And this needs to be led by the Global South or MAPA, because the Green New Deal by the US and the EU, they don't put us first. It's again a form of colonization. It's again built upon the exploitation of the members of the Global South, of MAPA. So this is one of the reasons that it needs to be led by us, and so that it gives us a livable future and not just benefits them. So yeah, if you could, I think, amplify MAPA and understand that what we're currently doing, all the solutions we're discussing right now is not enough. I think that's a conversation that's not been had, and no one has the strength to have it, because that would just mean, what are the solutions?
Okay. And then we have a question. There was a question, and the question is like, if you had the chance to speak to one specific world leader for 1 minute, to which leader would it be, and what would your message be?
That's actually a really hard question. I think I actually can't pick one. I'd speak to two. I'd speak to my prime minister first, because he's been doing a lot of policies, and he's been passing a lot of policies that aren't beneficial to us, the people, and they've been supporting corporates for the longest time. And I also want to speak to the president of the US, because they're one of the carbon majors, and they have a lot of say, and they're one of the most influential countries in the world, and they have a lot of say in how the climate crisis and whatever solutions we talk, how it's going to shape up. So these are the two people I'd like to talk to.
Okay. Just I see someone in the chat that put in the Q&A section, I want to ask something. Really feel free to do so, and then we can ask the question for them. And maybe a question that is linked to that. Recently, the Twitter account of Donald Trump was hacked because he didn't have a good password, and people were able to post on it whatever they want. And maybe it's a question for the yes men, but maybe also for Disha to answer. If you would have access to the Twitter account of Trump, what would you tweet? Or maybe if the yes man knows first what to answer, it's also free.
Do you want to go first, Disha? I'll go first. Okay. Well, I think that we would tweet whatever Disha wants to be tweeted. In other words, I would say, no, what we would do is we'd say, Disha, what are your demands? What do you need? And we will put that in Trump's voice, and we'll say that he's going to provide it, right? And then it puts Trump in a difficult position, because then he is in that position where he has to deny it. He has to say, no, I'm not doing it. So in real life, if his Twitter account is hacked and he says, I'm going to do more than meet the Paris Climate Accords. I'm going to make sure that we're outlawing fossil fuels entirely in this country. We're going to stop emitting. We're going to put pressure on all the other governments to stay below 1 degree, so that Disha, has a livable future, has a chance at a livable future. If he announces that from his Twitter account, obviously he wouldn't use those words exactly, but we'd have to write that one. But then when it's revealed that he didn't do it, he's going to have to tweet whatever he actually says about it, which is going to be brutal. It's going to reveal the brutality. It's going to reveal how awful he really is and that he doesn't care. And so I think that's the type of thing that we would do, something that gives him that dilemma, the dilemma action, puts him on the spot, gives him no way out in terms of what he can do next. So yeah, we just call Disha. If we got access, we'd be like, hey, Disha, what do you need to say? What is your actual position? You know, and we've used this tactic a lot, which is to basically impersonate somebody in power and make the announcement that you know they're never going to make, but that if people believe for a moment, opens up this great possibility in our minds about why it couldn't be that way. Because very often, at least in the United States, we're often taught that all of these policies are somehow natural, that there's no alternative. And this is also a feature of capitalism. Capitalism, there's a tendency for everybody to say, well, it's just the way it is. The market, you have to do it this way because it's the only thing we can afford to do. When actually, nothing could be further from the truth if you take the long view. Like, there's only one thing that we can afford to do, and that's provide a livable future. So yeah, that's what we would do. We call Disha.
Thank you so much. That actually, I think that's the message of the webinar taken very well. I think if I had access, I'd get as much evidence as possible against him. So like we have access to his DMs and stuff. So collect as much evidence as possible to prove his activities, because I know there's a lot on him already, but I think people have a hard time finding it. He hasn't been, thrown into jail or acquitted for whatever he's done. So collect more evidence and release it to the public so that the public can decide what a shitty person he is, because the yes men are already tweeting on that. So we're going to be a team and we're going to, they're going to be tweeting and I'm going to be collecting evidence. So that's what we're going to do.
A really creative way to deal with this question. I really like it. So maybe a last question, and then we can to round this up is for both of you as well. What is your favorite climate action that you have ever participated in or have seen?
Well, I think for me, the most moving thing was being at Standing Rock. It was just, a very intensely moving thing that was happening on the front lines of, the impacted people within the United States. It's like and so that was, I have so many stories, though. I don't even know where to begin because every time I get together, every time I go to one of these really mass protests with a lot of people, it's very emotionally satisfying, But then there's been a lot of these small actions that we've done too that have been very successful in terms of getting a lot of attention. And that also has a moment that's really, very fun and satisfying. So I think that I will share those links to some of our movies, and you actually see how much joy we have when we're doing it because we film it sometimes. Unlike most people, there's a camera pointing at us a lot of the time when we're doing things. And so yeah, you've actually asked a really hard question. Thanks.
For me, yeah, I can't really pick one, but I'll do like a top three. So the first, and in no particular order, the first one was Extinction Rebellion did this action called the Greener Google. So they basically had a page online that exposed, that announced that Google's going green, and they exposed that these are the ones that we're funding and we're going to stop funding them. So it was really great because like you could type greener Google and it would look like the exact, the homepage of Google, but only greener. And it's really important because this is a huge, huge industry, and holding them accountable was really, really impressive, like the amount of work they put in, and you're going up against such big like corporations. That was really inspiring for me. And also just, I like the tech aspect of it personally. And the second one was back in the 1980s, in India, the women of India, there was huge deforestation projects going on, and women. I don't think it was the 1980s. I got the dates a little messed up, but back in the day, all women came out in protest against the tree felling, and they hugged the trees. So that the corporations won't cut down the trees. This was popularly known as the Chipko movement. It's one of India's most famous protests. Um, and then they couldn't cut the trees because all the women, and this was at a time period when women weren't allowed to come out of their houses. It was taboo to even see their faces because they had to be under like a parda, which is like a piece of clothing with a sari that they'd have to cover their faces. So at a time like this, when women came out and hugged their trees, all of them women led, it was really inspiring. It was called the Chipko movement or Appiko movement in my this thing, and this was a nationwide thing. All states and all cities took part in this, and we recreated that quite recently at the beginning of this year, actually, when there was a huge tree felling project in my city to expand roads, which was completely unnecessary, and a lot of people would lose their lives. And when we recreated it, we decided to hold hands, and we made like a human chain across the trees. And it was just the feeling that you're connected to another human being, holding their hands, and you're striking for that. That was so powerful. It just like the Yasmin said, like all of these, just being in a huge crowd of people gives you hope for the future, because I get my hope from the people. It's not from the government, it's from the people. And the third one, as they're actually currently going on, India is witnessing farmer protests all over the country, which is one of the reasons today we didn't have a physical strike for the Fight for 1.5 campaign, because we didn't want to take away from them. And they're fighting against the reforms that the government has passed, that is once again pro corporations and industries and not pro farmers. Farming in India is what 60% of the country is dependent on. It's not just a job, it's a livelihood. It's a form of livelihood. You can't live without it. It's the backbone of India. So the fact that they would promote corporations instead of farmers is really disheartening. And more than like 200,000 people have been protesting for the last 2 months. And since December 28th, they've taken to the capital of the country, and they've been met with a lot of police brutality, but they've continued protesting. Even in my city, they were arrested for less than 10 minutes of protesting. So it's the fact that from 2 months, they've gone on, and like on ground protests, they've just camped outside of the capital of the city. Recently, they were let into the city, but they're just camped out, and it's like they've built lives there. Like they're camped out there until the government decides to withdraw all of the new reforms. And it's a community, and they just cook for each other and they feed each other. No, there's no money involved. This is what I imagine a community to be, where you just help each other regardless. And I think that's so powerful. So these are my 3 favorite protests and strikes.
Okay, thank you for this. So while you were explaining this, a last question tuned in, and I think it's actually an interesting question. It was for the Yesman, but I think Disha maybe can also answer it. So I think it's a question from Juan Cristobal. I think into the presentation of the Yesman, the Indian independence movement started by Gandhi was most authentic and impressive. Is Gandhi still a hero in India of today?
I can answer that. It's a bit controversial because Gandhi as a person has a lot of backdrops, because he was racist to when he was in Africa, and he was helping Black people with their struggles with the Britishers. And he was one of the more privileged people here. There have been instances and accusations of him of sexual assault against his wife. And one thing I don't believe in is, like worshipping one person so much that you idolize them and worship them to a god level. I don't believe that one person in any movement is the catalyst of change. Every movement has been built by several people. It's by people and groups together. So I don't believe in idolizing one person. And so yeah, it's not a yes or no question. It's not black and white.
I think also that's why when we show pictures of the Salt March, we try to show pictures that include like Sarojini Naidu, who is also a leader, who is not, and actually even the way we speak about the Indian independence movement, to say it was started by Gandhi is a falsehood, because it predates Gandhi, of course. The idea of an Indian independent place it existed before, before colonialism, and then throughout the colonial period, there were people who were advocating for being free of a colonial oppression. So it's it's one of those things where we try to get away from the cult of personality as well, and yet the stories are that we have are often skewed in that direction. And so when we retell them, we often we have to watch what we're saying carefully these days. And there's a lot of also we don't have to remember things in the same way. We can interpret history through the lens that we have now, and maybe we can be more informed as we move ahead.
That's a nice quote to end this webinar with, I think. Thanks again, the Yes Man and Disha, for being here, and thanking for all the people on Zoom and on YouTube who watched our webinar. At 14 GMT, we will be back with another webinar where we will see how you actually can start a movement, because now we have seen why we do it and which actions are effective. And for the next webinar, we will have Mitzi Jonel from the Philippines, and Canvas, also a great movement who do a lot of things. So we'll be happy to see you back at 14 GMT, and thanks again, all of you, for being here.
Thank you.